Live to discuss is political scientist and former head of the United States Studies Centre, Simon Jackman. Good to see you, Simon. Thanks for joining us. As we just heard there, President Joe Biden pledged that the US is prepared to use all elements of its national power to stop Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. How significant was this statement, especially given he made it in Israel?
Look, incredibly significant. I would, though, nonetheless point out there were some subtle shades of difference in some of the earlier statements in the visit between the Israeli Prime Minister and Biden. Biden's language refers to stopping Iran from getting a weapon. The Israeli Prime Minister was quite bellicose, frankly, saying that the West implying that the West collectively would take military action to stop the nuclear program. Now, you might say, well, what's the difference there? There's a difference between a weapon and letting them develop a nuclear program. And I think Biden was just trying to indicate that there were some limits to just where the US's red line was versus perhaps where Israel would like it to be. But the initial point is the correct one, and that is it's an incredibly significant statement for an American president to offer Israel that degree of support on a visit to Israel about a matter with that degree of specificity nonetheless. We can quibble over program versus weapon, but even if you grant it, they're going to work together on the program, a very strong self-support for Israel from President Biden.
So what is Joe Biden's agenda on this Middle East trip? What does he need to achieve here?
Look, it's a region of the world that hasn't received as much attention by design, right, and by accident. And the design is, I think, a determination by the Biden administration to signal to the alliance network that China was foreign policy priority number one. Then, of course, we've got the Ukraine matter. And I think you can't afford, no US president can afford to take their eye off the ball with respect to the Middle East for long. That's for both US domestic reasons, but also for reasons to do with just how important that part of the world is with respect to global security broadly. But as the report that let us in suggested, right now Biden's presidency is being undone by the high cost of petrol in the United States. His approval ratings are in the low 30s. Most Democrats do not want him to run again. He is in big trouble domestically with his political capital being eroded. Anything he can do, and he's got to play nice with people he would probably otherwise not be wanting to talk to. The Crown Prince, who has been linked to this murder of a US citizen, as the report was indicating. Anything to try and get a bit more global supply of oil, particularly given the Russia situation and particularly given his own domestic political woes. I think it's enormously important for Joe Biden, and a lot of, it's all about the domestic politics, and there's an awful lot pushing him towards kicking some goals on this trip to the Middle East.
Certainly, and as you mentioned, that very important and what will be probably an interesting meeting with Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia. In terms of this meeting, does Joe Biden need to push the leader on human rights issues, or will he be thinking in his head about the domestic problems, as you just alluded to?
I think you just heard him push him on the human rights issue in that press statement. He'll do that publicly. I think that checks the box, perhaps with respect to domestic constituencies on his left, back in the Democratic caucus, back in the US Congress, who would be, frankly, really scratching their heads about how far Biden's going to go down the road towards appeasing the Crown Prince. But the simple fact of the matter is, I think behind closed doors, I think there'll be, again, perhaps a check-the-box reference to it. But the heart of the matter is, I think, global security concerns, quite regional concerns, rather, around security to do with Saudi Arabia and what they're doing in Yemen, number one. Number two, getting them on the same page with respect to coordinated allied action and at least not disagreement with respect to the stance with respect to Russia. And then, of course, what can be done about increasing the oil spigot, pumping more oil into the global economy. And again, because it is really of near existential concern for Joe Biden politically back home in the United States.
Speaking of human rights, should Joe Biden have pushed Israel on its human rights record, given that Amnesty International, as well as the Human Rights Watch, deem it an apartheid state?
Look, great question, Danica. The answer is yes. I would say he should and ought to. But again, don't underestimate. Look, it's very tricky for any American president to how hard to push Israel on that. It becomes a wedge issue, or a way to wedge yourself, if you will, for both Republican presidents and for Democratic presidents. It's really, for a Democratic president, it's the left of his party that wants to see tough talk with respect to the Israelis on the Palestinian question and potential human rights violations. Again, elections aren't decided by the left of the Democratic Party. Biden's problem right now is with the center of American politics. And moreover, for Donald Trump, Trump was one of the best US presidents that Israel has ever had. Biden just can't do a complete turnaround on that. And moreover, I think in a region where the US needs friends and allies, there's only so far, I think, any US president, but perhaps particularly one that's not carrying a great set of cards with his domestic political capital like Joe Biden, can really, go out and be a little more, if you will, adventurous or crazy brave with respect to the human rights question vis-a-vis Israel itself.